Before Christmas, the Quebec government announced something to the tune of $900,000 to train police services in Quebec on racial profiling. I believe that the most of the money will go to the police academy in Nicolette, and that the Quebec Human Rights and Youth Rights Commission, as well as the Quebec Police Ethics Commissioner, will participate in developing this training and delivering this training to police officers or future police officers. So there's a lot of, obviously, investment on the part of the provincial and the city governments into policing, and it's a way to, among other things, to modernize it, to bring its competency levels to the level of, we call it the charter levels in terms of discrimination and profiling. I think the question is not only whether there should be more investment, but it should rather be how the developments of these programs will be and who will be involved in it, whether the communities most affected by racial profiling will be invited to participate in the development and the delivery of these training programs, because training is about developing knowledge, competencies, and skills, and changing behaviors, changing attitudes, and even changing organizational practices. And if there is no direct community input, something is amiss. We will continue to talk in abstraction about the very people who are affected by racial profiling. And, we know that most police cadets, most police officers don't reflect Montreal, don't reflect society the way things are right now. And that's why it's important to have community input and involvement as active participants in these programs.
Thank you. I didn't know about Quebec investing this money. Do you know how much? I mean, you did mention a little bit, but do you know how much this will affect Montreal?
Yeah, it's $900,000, and you can find it in the press release of the Minister of Public Safety that was made before Christmas. And at the time when the news broke, we already raised some questions with some media about the need for community consultation, participation, and even in the evaluation process, because any effective and credible training program must carry a component of evaluation of knowledge, post-training evaluation. And so we have no idea what's going on. So obviously it's kept very much within or among the institutions involved. And this is not about opening up the police services and institutions for greater community participation and community relations, because we can only change things if the communities, the very people most affected by bad policing, by bias policing, can participate in helping bring about change to the policies, the practices, and the behaviors.
So I have been trying to chase down SPVM Media Relations. Unfortunately, haven't received anything back. So as soon as I do, I'll let you know what kind of information they're able to tell me. But for the meantime, is there anything you know about what's going on, or just kind of anything you'd like to say about these, how this is affecting Montreal?
Well, one of the things that I think that we want to push in terms of change, especially with the newly elected city administration, is this kind of, shall we say, lack of transparency and lack of inclusion and lack of consultation between the police department and the communities. When we talk about communities, by the way, we're talking about both the French-speaking and the English-speaking communities, racialized or otherwise, on the island of Montreal, because our concern is that these things are too often done without the presence and the participation of English-speaking people. And Montreal is about English-speaking and French-speaking people of all racial, ethnic, and other backgrounds. So we need to be inclusive. We need to be more transparent. For example, one of the things, too, we've been also raising some questions about is there's been a lot of talk about gun violence and increase a multi-million-dollar investment over the next 5 years into crime prevention initiatives and community partnership to do prevention work. immediate question is, what are those criteria? How it would be handled? How will the application be solicited, evaluated, and decided? To what extent do English-speaking communities of particularly racialized communities, will they have a say in it? Will be able to participate? Will they get the funding? Because, as you know, youth and violence affects every group in our city. And we're always concerned that, this kind of approach, that we are the institution, we know best, we don't need community consultation, input, and participation in the planning, delivery, or evaluation, whether it's for training, in terms of for prevention, or any other law enforcement initiatives, will be doomed to fail, or will be doomed in terms of getting public support and public buy-in, because if people are excluded from the beginning, very likely many of these programs will not be designed in a way that will be responsive to or representative of the needs and the interests of the communities.
Thank you. Do you think that there needs to be more of a focus on, prevention, such as, support services, just more like, activities for youth, things like this, to actually prevent gun violence and things like this at the root, rather than just, policing the after effects?
Yes, prevention is always possibly the most ideal, and prevention is not a magic wand. As mentioned, is not an immediate magical solution. Prevention is long term. All the literature, all the research studies on crime prevention in the United States and in Canada have shown that basically it takes ongoing, sustained, long-term investment in communities, in community infrastructure, to remove those conditions conducive to crime and violence and delinquency. And one of the most important causal factors that we need to address is the lack of employment opportunities for young people, meaningful, adequately paid jobs, the lack of not only the feeling, but the reality, the real sense of belonging that many young people don't have. So those can only be achieved but through long-term, ongoing, sustained prevention work. And of course, we also need to look at not only what government can do, but also what the private sector can do, because government is not and cannot be the solution for all. Government will be most effective in curtailing the circulation of firearms, because gun violence is getting to a very, very critical level, and we need to find ways basically to control the availability of guns. Sometimes we have the feeling that the gun lobby or the gun industry is it's too easy to acquire guns legally or illegally here. So we need to have a very, very strong government action on that. But with the rest, in terms of prevention, community, private sector, even labor unions and governments have to work together to create those socio-economic conditions conducive to the prevention of crime, delinquency, and violence. And one of the things I must say, that in Montreal, we do not have a tradition of getting the private sector involved in addressing community and social development needs, as in Toronto, as in many other North American cities. So that's also a cultural change that needs to happen in order to ensure that there is true partnership for ongoing and sufficient means to address the root cause of violence and crime. We know that the level of unemployment among young people of color in some parts of Montreal is twice the level of ordinary youth unemployment, and that's not acceptable. And as long as there's poverty, there's marginalization, there's disenfranchisement, both economically, socially, and politically speaking, then we still have very, very serious problems of violence, among other things.
When you say get the private sector involved, do you mean specifically in terms of creating more jobs?
Creating jobs, creating training program, investment in community, let's say the sports. Some communities in some neighborhoods told us that to get involved in a sports program, some of the young people don't even have money to buy the equipment. So you can imagine, okay, companies can basically make a donation of $1,000 equipment or any other facilities to help even repair facilities, and those solutions can come from the private sector. Especially that we see the level of profits for some companies. I'm sure that they can drop just basically 1% of their investment into these communities and community infrastructure, and that will make a big difference for a lot of people. I know one hockey group basically is, and also one football group, and basically some of the youth have problems buying the equipment because some of these equipment cost you easily $500.
Very true. Thank you for explaining that. Just
And I just want to make sure also when we talk of prevention in communities and in neighborhoods, it's basically across racial lines. People who are poor and who are of low income, be they black or white or brown, they should also be included in all these prevention measures and should also be a benefit from these prevention investments.
Thank you. Just continuing on to talk about, prevention and police. After the protests, we saw the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, and Valerie Plante stating that she would be open to looking into defunding, and then that fall, she provided more money towards the SPVM, and then just this has continued each year. I don't know. Do you have a reaction, any thoughts you'd like to share on this?
I think that many of these protests since the George Floyd tragedy have shown that they don't produce long-term consequences. They are not sustained. They're not sustainable. It's like a flash mob. And they don't have the structure or the ongoing persistence, especially with pressure on policymakers to produce the kind of change that a lot of young people want. And I'm not even sure what the electoral participation rate last November in the city elections among young people, especially those who basically was, the 1,000 people who marched against racism and for the recognition of systemic racism in Quebec. And as long as it's like a flash mobs with no, shall we say, the long-term pressure and political engagement on the part of these young people, nothing will change. And at the same time, we know that police unions are very powerful, and you have more conservative groups that are much better organized and more sustained in their approach towards, maintaining the status quo. And that's what we see. And we see not only in the Black Lives Matters, we're also dealing with the Me Too movement, and many of these things, they don't have that kind of long-term, sustainable, and well-structured approach to policy change, and that's why we don't see a lot of change. We still have to. We can talk about it. We chat a lot on Facebooks about it, but we don't get down to the ground and get things moving on the ground and build things from the ground up.
Thank you. So yeah, I know I've asked a lot of questions that is related to your work, but not specifically about it. So I guess I do wanted to get into that. I know over the years that we've been talking, and I've been following things you've been up to, you have represented a lot of people who've experienced racial profiling by the police brutality by the police. Have you seen this maybe like increasing over the years, or just in terms of the the racial profiling training that the SPVM did have? Do you think you've kind of noticed at all a culture change? Or I know that's a wide open question, but any thoughts?
Yes. Thank you for the question. Actually, we have seen some changes. We have seen one of the changes we've seen is a greater institutional acknowledgement that the problem exists. Sometimes they don't name the racial profiling words. They don't use the term, but we know that there are movements and there are measures within those institutions to address the need to change policies, change practices, changing behaviors is now it's a priority for some departments. In Longueuil, I think, is a good example, and we have seen also some movement before the courts in terms of greater judicial acknowledgement of racial profiling and also judicial sanctions imposed against police officers before the police ethics tribunal for racial profiling. But we still have to sustain the pressure and continue with legal action to make sure that we can achieve broader, systemic, and more sustainable change. One of the things we've seen, actually, sometimes we've seen setbacks. One setback is that while the entire provincial justice system is moving towards mediation as a way to resolve early litigation and also other disputes, the Montreal police, most police departments, systemically and systematically refuse to engage in mediation to resolve these cases at the early stage, and they would go on with litigation for a year or two or three as a way to hopefully to they're putting pressure on very likely the victims. And so that's one of the contradictions that we hope that will end, because even in all kinds of litigation we've seen a move towards mediation, except when it comes to suing the police departments for racial profiling. And police departments and the city employers don't want to engage in mediation for early dispute resolution. And this is one of the anomalies of the justice system that we hope will be addressed this year in 2022.
Are there things outside of sensitivity and racial profiling training for police that need to be done to address the situation?
Yes, so one of the more effective ways and more honest way to address racial profiling or any form of racial bias in policing is the need for the police department and for the city acting as employer of these police officers to recognize the existence of systemic racism. Because often it's not about the individual behaviors or attitudes of the officer, but often it's about the organization's policies, directives, and structure that push many of these officers towards biased conduct. And that's why there's resistance to any recognition of systemic racism does not help. It hinders, and it makes basically the real problem being hidden behind other kinds of issues, such as this. Sometimes we know it's not the officer's personal individual conduct. Sometimes we know the officer has to carry out a directive to stop almost systematically a black driver in a certain location. Obviously, the directive comes from high above, and as long as the police chief, the police administration, the city is not held accountable for such a policy directive, then we can continue to go after the individual officers, but we are not able to go to the heart of the problem, which is some kind of policy, some kind of directives from high above that compels the many officers to do what they have to do. They're doing their job, and to a certain extent, it's unfair for many officers because they just take marching orders, and the heart of the problem is not being touched, which is biased policies and directives and ways of doing things at the top.
Would you be able to maybe name some of these biased policies?
We have found in one case that is going before the Human Rights Tribunal of a policy directive in one municipality, North Montreal, which I won't mention because we want to reserve that for when it comes to the tribunal hearing, that apparently there's a view that criminal elements from Montreal are taking advantage of greater access to better transport means to move to the suburbs in order to continue their criminal activity, and therefore they should be scrutinized more. Potential gang members should be more subject to scrutiny. Who are potential gang members? Who are the gang members that are not defined? But sometimes we know that when we read between the lines, you're talking about basically black men. So that's an example, and it's a written policy. that the Human Rights Commission dug up in its investigation. So we hope that will be certainly presented to show that obviously we cannot talk about combating racial profiling without going after those systemic factors, which are policies and directives from the top. And ultimately, too, one of the things that we need to look at is police chiefs ultimately have to be held personally liable if year after year the police department are basically the target of racial profiling and the other civil rights lawsuits. Because in the end, the CEO, like in a private company, must be held accountable.
That's a good point. Thank you. Do you have, sorry to continue on this, but are there any maybe former human rights cases that you've represented in terms of, bias policies that maybe there were a success story or not that you could kind of be able to just discuss a little bit more?
Well, there's another systemic practice. We believe it comes from some sort of policy directive, which we have not been able to put our hands on it, but we've seen, because case after case, year after year, we start to see it clearly now, is this tendency or the practice on the part of police officers to stop almost systematically any car with a rental license plate driven by a black male driver or even black female driver. So there's an association of rented cars with criminal elements or activities. And we believe that comes from some policy directive somewhere, and we haven't. We hope to get to the bottom of this. That's why I speak to you now. Just last 2 weeks ago, at the end of January, we had another case of a young black man driving a Mercedes with a rented commercial license plate and was stopped by the police in Montreal North. And within a matter of minutes, he was arrested because first, a 19-year-old black male driving a Mercedes. Actually, it's a father's car, rented car, and he had to basically account some sort of mechanical counter in his car. It's sometimes you check on the vehicle's sort of engine, and the police officer automatically assumed that equipment is used to steal cars. So they arrested him. They handcuffed him right on the spot without any further questioning. And again, we've seen the pattern of driving a rented car as being suspicious, and that does not come from basically some sort of personal attitude. We believe that comes from a directive somewhere, and we need to find it. And we hope to find it, and we will find it eventually if these cases go to court, because that's not the only case that we have.
That's how you find it out, when the case goes to court.
That's right. Yeah. Now, we have about 4 or 5 cases like this in Montreal that stop because you're black and you're driving a rented car. So it's, and usually the attitude of the officers from the get-go is very hostile and very suspicious.
When you say 4 to 5 cases, are those current ones?
Yeah, current ones, yeah. Yeah, driving a rented cars, and they seem to automatically to be assumed to be something illegal or in something shady, and so we hope to. The advantage that we have is when we, because of the number of cases we have over the years, so we have been able to draw a pattern, and so that's why we talk about systemic policies and practices that go beyond the individual or personal bias on the part of the officers who intercept a car or who mistreat a driver.
Thank you for explaining that. That's horrible to know, but good to explore in this story. I guess I'm kind of curious because I'm from Toronto, and I really can't recall many times that I can't recall any time I've seen police in riot gear, but that's one of the first things I noticed coming here, during protests, especially, police brutality protests, protests that are, addressing racial inequality and things like this within our society. Police are often wearing riot gear. Do you kind of have any thoughts on this, especially with the police budget increasing?
Yeah, well, very likely that because of 9/11, we've moved in the last 2 decades towards a greater trend of militarizing police services. You can see in the kind of equipments and military gears and also tactics of, among other things, of crowd control. You're right in the sense of basically it's now any kind of public protest or a peaceful protest usually are treated from the outset as by the police just by their mere presence and their military gears as if they're going to be a very, very shall we say high level of danger and violence. And then you look at what happened in Washington D.C. on January the 6th, or you look at more of the truckers' protests in Ottawa, you can see the stark disparity in the way that these protests are being handled by the law enforcement agencies. So, we have to start raising these questions, and that's why I strongly encourage people of all backgrounds, of all ages, to participate more in city affairs, in civic affairs, hearings or public council meetings, and to ask questions to our city councilors and local administration officials as to the justification of these expenses, of these styles of intervention, of these, the equipments, because without active questioning, without very, very rigorous demands for accountability, things won't change. And we should not, and I'm not talking about just a handful of groups of we call it the usual protesters, but ordinary people as well. Especially those who have to pay taxes, because that's basically, it's their tax dollars that are being used for these things. And as long as those taxpayers, your typical average middle class taxpayers, if they don't ask the questions because they don't have that concerns for the direction of our local democratic governance, then we won't be able to solve the problem the way we wanted to see them solved.